Hello, everyone. John Adkison here again, doing interviews for the docu-series I'm planning to put together called Circumcision Harms. And I have Marc from Australia here. Marc, please introduce yourself and tell us how you got to be involved with this.
Oh, look, thanks, John. Mark, I'm 53-year-old. I live in central Victoria, which is one of the southern states in Australia. And I've, through the circumstances of my life, I've been involved as an intactivist now for just over 30 years.
Wow.
And being an intactivist in Australia is quite challenging, to be upfront with you, John, because in Australia, we don't talk about these things. Those that are familiar with the land down under will know that we only talk about sport. We're not allowed to talk about religion, sex, or politics, because perhaps we'll argue about these things and friendships will fall away. I find that when I do interact with my friends from the United States, I find it rather liberating because we can disagree and still be friends, and no subject is taboo. So I do admire that.
That's great. I have my experience hasn't been all that different than what it sounds like you experienced in Australia. A lot of people don't want to have conversations about religion, and they're definitely open to having conversations about football or our version of football or anything like that. But yeah, and religion is is mostly restricted to conversations at church, and this particular topic is not is typically avoided as well there. So.
Indeed, indeed.
All right. Do you mind sharing your status as far as are you circumcised or not?
I'm an intact male.
Did you say that and I just missed it? It probably went right over my head. Yeah, so most of my interviews in the past have been either like advocates that are women or men that are directly victims of this. I think I've had two other interviews. One man from Germany who's intact, and Sam Carnes, who also has his own YouTube channel, who is also intact and a big advocate. So I have a list of topics that I try to cover. So we try to cover the whole grounds as much as possible about all the different ways that genital cutting rituals in the world affect people and affect our world. So the big highlights are starting off with the physical aspects of how we're harmed. Primarily, I'm just focusing on that with the male circumcision thing. Most people agree that, yeah, female circumcision or female genital mutilation is horrible, whatever. So I'm not going to, we might cover that. We'll cover that a little bit in the end. But after looking at the physical aspects, we'll jump into how that affects sex with our sexual partners. And then we'll get into the psychological effects of all that, how it hurts us, not just the people that are victims directly, but also the sexual partners, as well as parents and children and medical professionals, et cetera, et cetera. And then we'll jump into relationships and how it creates challenges in between people. Then we'll get into the FGM aspect of this, and we'll probably also talk a little bit about intersex normalization surgeries. And then the very last but not least, how all of this affects social productivity in the world. So,
Okay.
you probably, since you said that you watched some of my other videos, so you've already seen this. my dildo, not a dildo, but I have a fellow genital autonomy advocate that also has YouTube videos, and she got in trouble for one time showing a dildo on a YouTube video. So
oh gosh.
hopefully YouTube doesn't get mad at me for my yarn thing.
Pops the fine.
Yeah. So the first topic I cover is about what's cut off, and I address the word called acropostion, and that's is referred to as the part that hangs off the end of the penis, the skin that hangs off past the glands or the head of the penis. And supposedly the old form, like BC era, they only cut off that part. They didn't cut off everything. They did not lay bare the glands, as it's written in Jewish texts. And it's been identified scientifically by the Sorrells and the Bossio studies that yes, this is sensitive skin. Well, how about that? It's highly innervated and highly vascularized. I don't know why we had to have studies to prove that. I mean, it's like just ask some intact men. Yeah, it's living tissue. It's not like clipping fingernails or cutting hair, and it's something that does not grow back after it's removed. So removing it is an amputation of sorts. And even the AP themselves in the 70s, their first policy statement about it was, well, it's there to protect the glands. That's all they had to say about it. I shake my head sometimes at the AP, and it's like, how, it's like, why not include this other information? But anyways, that's all they wanted to say about it, I guess, back then. And yeah, it's true. It's kind of like your eyelid protecting your eyes. It's your glands is similar to your tongue. It's a mucosal body part. It's supposed to be covered and protected. And then we have the rolling mechanism of it. So it's similar to your eyelid that it has two sides. It's got the skin side and it's got the mucosal side, right? But instead of just being a single layer of skin, it's a fold of skin. It goes up and then goes back down to the to meet the base of the glands. So when the penis becomes erect, it starts to unroll down the penis. So you see this rolling mechanism, and it acts like a rolling bearing. And people like to use the term turtleneck a lot. It's like, well, actually, that's a very good way of looking at it. The turtle moves its head in and out, and that skin folds up around its head as it moves in, and then unfolds as it moves out. And just imagine cutting that off of a poor turtle. It would just be animal torture, and he'd have to live with it for the rest of his life. He'd have a hard time moving his head out. So it shouldn't be rocket science.
Sure.
And as I'm going through this, if there's anything you'd like to add from your perspective about any of these things, please feel free to chime in.
Yes, John, I find it quite frustrating that the AAP in the United States in 2012 did say that the benefits outweighed the risks. The Australasian College, which covers the paediatric work in both Australia and New Zealand, are quite neutral on the subject. Mm-hmm. They're saying it's not medically necessary, but there are pros and cons, and if the decision should be left up to the family, if they wished to, they could elect to have the surgery. And so in Australia, we don't have as many networks as you do in the United States. There's really only 4 or 5 main networks, and they've all had current affairs highlights of this subject, and it's always left with the issue that it's a dilemma for parents. Many of the families I know, many of the ones I speak to, just turn to me and say, Mark, we don't know what to do. We're just left with a difficult decision, and everybody says it's up to us. I do find it frustrating that the position is not taken, that because there are no medical indications for it, that it's discouraged, and only for religious or for medical indications we would encourage you to do this procedure. In quite a number of the states in Australia, because health is administered by each province or state, I don't know what it's like in the United States. Generally in Australia, in a public hospital, they won't do it unless it's for a religious purpose. The catch to that, though, John, is that in Australia, private health insurance is quite affordable. Yeah. The government actually give you 1/3 of the cost back via a rebate.
Yeah.
And they penalize you in your taxes if you earn a certain level of income if you don't take it out. So people have access to private health insurance to give birth in private hospitals. And I can tell you, mate, if I could use an Australian term there, that in a private hospital, the pressure is there.
Really? Okay.
And the figures that they quote you are not quite right. Yeah. The 10 to 15% in Australia, I think, represents about half of what the true figure is. Okay. Because the circumcisions that occur in the clinics, they're not generally picked up in the stats.
Yeah.
I was quite disappointed with the treatment of the issue that we had when my two sons were born, to be honest.
So, if I'm hearing you right, there's a certain level of capitalism, even within the hospitals in Australia.
In the private hospitals, very much so.
Okay, in the private hospitals. So, not necessarily the government provided hospitals.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a similar situation in Canada, from what I understand. It's like the public health insurance definitely don't cover it, but you can go to a clinic down the road or whatever, like Pollock, for example, and get it done.
So I'll just tell you now, John, that when my sons were born, some of the nurses, the maternal nurses, which, you know, in a hospital, the midwife type nurses are separate to the generalist nurses. Mm-hmm. They were all whispering in my wife's ear that if you need a hand with getting the procedure done, we can assist you, we can help you. We know the doctors that come and do it. Yeah. I was quite surprised that there was an elderly lady who was in the hospital admin. Mm-hmm. She approached my wife and said to her that, you know, you have to do it. You know, your son has to match your the father. And I'm like thinking, how on earth does this God-blessed woman know what my status is? my wife's got a Middle Eastern accent. I've got brown skin, so they just make the assumption and they tell her it's got to be done.
Well, did they? You think they're assuming that you're Muslim?
Well, that's probably what they thought, which I'm not. Yeah. And even if I was, one of the common myths is that it is a commandment or mandatory in Islam, and it's not.
No, it's not.
It's not in the Quran. It's in a tradition and a hadith. And some of my Muslim friends who are a bit scholarly have showed me passages in the Quran that actually make a very strong case against it. But yeah. That's another story.
Yeah.
So then we go to the GP for a checkup, and the GP is promoting it. And then for the first 2 years in life, you do see a specialist maternal nurse who answers your questions away from the hospital, etc. And she was giving us options of there are certain doctors in the region that will do it, and they're good, and these are the techniques they use. So whilst we weren't being told to do it, it was more than subtle pressure if I could make the case for that.
Okay.
And I'm living in a country where intactivists generally think it's safe, Australia, that there's no issues here. But there are.
There are. Okay.
I was, for the first 5 years, I was involved with a father's play group, a kind of networking organization, and the subject came up. And then I was obviously interested, and I asked around, how many of you have done it? And in a provincial town that I live in, a town of about 100,000, you know, there was about 15 or so fathers. Just about half had done it.
Really?
And,
wow.
And I understood why, because of this pressure that was applied through the private hospitals and etc. Yeah. And John, when I was born in the 1960s, everybody was done. Mm-hmm. It was the opt-out version. Going through school, primary school, high school, I was the only boy that was intact. So all the adult males around my age, give or take 10 or 15 years, they've all been cut.
Yeah.
And so if that's what they're used to, they want their sons to look like them. Mm-hmm. The women are conditioned that this is what the male element should look like. Yeah. I can understand why it's still quite popular.
Yeah. Yeah, it's self-replicating meme plaques, as Dr. I'm going blank on his name right now. Anyways, there's a doctor, he's done some, you can look up the history of circumcision or whatever, and his name will pop up. And memeplex is one of the words he uses. It's a self-propagating memeplex. But
Mm.
it's that's really kind of disheartening to hear. I was hearing that they weren't even allowing it in at least not in the public hospitals in Australia.
Mm.
But at the same time, it sounds like similar to Canada, the rates have dropped drastically, primarily
Indeed.
because it's been removed from, or at least drastically removed from public funding.
And that's a very good case, because it's been removed in the public system, and also most insurances don't cover it now, so it is an extra expense.
Yeah.
And if you have to, as the Australians would put it, fork out $500 to $700 for the procedure, that would make some think again.
Yeah.
But it is still very popular, John, because if you think about it, most people don't really research this. Most people don't really think about this. Yep. You've got a mother who thinks that this is what should be done. You've got a dad who wants the boy to look like himself. To actually stop this cycle takes a level of deliberate intervention.
Yep.
And that's the frustrating component about the work that you and I are involved in on a volunteer basis.
And the medical professionals aren't incensed to help put an end to this in a lot of cases, because they make money from doing it, right?
That's probably the most disappointing aspect of it, John, because the Hippocratic Oath and the rest of it.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me either. So we'll actually get down one of the things when we get into relationships. We'll talk a little bit about the doctor-patient relationships. So back to the physical aspects of what's harmed when the prep use is removed. So we talked about the rolling mechanism, and there's also the moisture or lubrication that happens because it is mucosal. So just like the inside of other mucosal parts of your body, there's a fluid there, right? And then there's the frenulum, and that gets affected one way or another, sometimes more so in certain kinds and less so in others. That's in this image, in this thing right here, there's like two little lines there. It shows it, or tries to show it. This isn't a very good representation of it. You kind of have to look at a real penis to really get how it works. But it's similar to the part underneath your tongue that goes from the bottom of your tongue down to the bottom of your mouth. My oldest son happened to have a tongue tie, and his was kind of well, it was stretched to the end of it was connecting to the very end of his tongue, and it's not supposed to go all the way out there, and it was holding it back. So when he opened his mouth and start crying or whatever, his tongue would fork out, and because the frenulum was holding it back. And there's this thing called frenulum breve, where the frenulum is too small for men, and they have to do something to address that. But the frenulum, according to the Sorrells study, is a very, very sensitive area, very, very important to sex. I've more paid attention to my own sexual activities. The more I've recognized that, it's pretty important. And I'm kind of lucky because I believe I was cut with a Mogen clamp, where they clamp it off at the end. They pull the skin forward, and then they clamp it off at the end. So that ends up leaving the intermucosal area there. So my frenular area that kind of spreads out my below the bottom of the glands is still there, and I have that sensitivity. But others are cut with Bell methods, like the Plastibell or the Gomco Clamp, where they put something over the glands in order to protect it. And I think this was kind of born from the problems that occurred with the Mogen Clamp. The Mogen Clamp business actually ended up getting sued out of existence because of all the botches that would occur, where the glands would get crimped by the clamp itself when they're supposed to be putting it past the glands. But humans make mistakes, so all these damages occurred. So that's more Plastibells and Gomco clamps.
My understanding is, John, that with the Gomco clamp, that it's a separate small procedure to remove the frenulum, which the doctors are encouraged to do, which if they're removing the foreskin for cosmetic reasons or so-called hygiene, what is the obsession with going back there with a small pair of scissors and cutting off the frenulum? I've never understood that.
I'll explain that. So the intermucosal part of the penis or of the prepuce is attached. It's adhered to the glands, much like your fingernails attached to your fingers, right? And the body tries to heal itself through scar tissue, right? So one of the effects that I'll bring up again, but things sometimes you end up with skin bridges if things aren't properly cared for after the circumcision is done. So they want to make sure that frenulum isn't pulling up on anything that's left over. So they have to snip that whatever leftover frenulum is there, so it's not tugging on the prepuce to pull it back up to touch the glands. You want to keep it separated as much as possible. So they're always telling parents for after the procedure is to put Vaseline on it at every diaper change, and that keeps it adhering from happening. But again, we're dealing with humans that make mistakes here. Parents might not do enough diaper changes or whatever, and then you end up with those skin bridges that occur.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the frenulum. Oh, I forgot one other part. So sometimes they'll like take a scalpel and run up underneath the glands and cut out the whole frenulum. So all the tissue that's there, and then somehow they pull up what's left down below and attach, stitch it, or I don't know how they make it attach. I've spoken with some guys that have had that level of procedure done. But for the most part, when you look at real life penises, you can see there's like two tones of skin. There's the mucosal part, and there's the shaft skin, and then you go down to the scrotum. And you could pretty well guess that the ones that have very small amounts of mucosal skin left, they were cut with a bell of some sort. And the guys like me, or you have a lot of mucosal skin left, they were probably cut with either like a barzel or a Gomco, or a Mogen Clamp. And now there's these other things, like I guess there's a Shang ring thing too that came out of China, but that's fairly new.
My friends who are urological nurses tell me that in Australia, skin bridges is a very common issue, that infants have to go in and children have to go in to see the urologist to have corrected. And when I saw my urologist for a prostate checkup, I asked him about circumcision, and he said that one of the most common surgeries he has to do is corrective surgery for circumcisions that were not ideal. So what you're describing, I completely understand that it's a risky procedure, which is a very inexact science in my view.
Yeah. And I often wonder if you even need to see a urologist, because urologists are supposed to deal with the urinary tract, right? And the only reason why urologists are involved is because this area, this skin and everything, is closely close to that urinary tract. So really you could just have a plastic surgeon do it. And even if they go in and they try to fix that skin bridge or whatever, they're going to leave some sort of scar tissue there on the glands, and it's not going to feel like it was supposed to. Anyone that has a decent sized scar, like I have a big scar from my appendectomy, knows, scar tissue doesn't, you don't feel much right where the scar is, and things surrounding the scar might be really uncomfortable or have problems, or like mine itches all the time. So
the other thing you've got to bear in mind, which you may or may not be aware of, John, is that people with dark pigmented skin, our derm is a lot tougher and thicker, and we are much more prone to keloid. And I often wonder about those delicate surgeries with people with skin conditions like mine, because it can be difficult during the healing process.
It would be. I've often thought it would be nice to just go study dermatology. It would be a curious thing to understand, and maybe it would help me understand this a little bit better.
Yeah. So people with pigmented skin like me would know that after surgery, we've often got to go back for cortisone injections to flatten out the keloids. It's no racial offense, but white guys like you wouldn't know much about that.
Yeah, I should talk to my doctor about possible cortisone injection for my huge scar. Maybe it would feel better. I don't know. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Then there's the ridged band. I want to share with us on this or not. I'd like to hear more from more guys, but I think Mike. You know Michael Winnell? He's actually Australian. With Foreskin Revolution. He
very well
invented
known.
the foreskin fist bump. Or
he appears quite often on our major network like SBS, and so he's quite well known here.
Awesome. Yeah. That's good to hear. Him and the people that are working with him are making a huge splash on this.
Yeah.
And he's intact, and he talks in detail about how the preputial works and feels and all that. And one of the things that I hear is that the ridged band, this is the part that is similar to your lips, right? It's the part where the inner mucosa meets the outer layer of skin. And what's unique about this is that you also have the dartos fascia, the musculature part inside the skin that makes it close up. And for young boys, it actually acts like a one-way sphincter. It allows fluid out, but it keeps things from getting in. And when there's an erection going on, and that starts sliding down and opening up over the glands, because the glands is shaped in a way that it would make it stretch out, that process alone has its own sensations. It's an erotic sensation of its own. So that's something guys like me are completely missing out on.
Unless you restore.
Well, I don't think the ridged band grows back. You don't get all the nerves and everything.
Yeah, no, fair point. Fair point.
Yeah.
The thing I don't understand, John, is that when a mother hands over a baby for the first time, the moment she gets the baby back, she sees that it's no longer the same child. And I've seen a raw wound. It looks despicably hideous. It's red, it's raw, it looks anything but natural. The bit I don't get is those that have a second and third boy, how they hand it over for the exact same thing. It's not the way God intended this to be. He has created us in perfect form. That is my belief. And the fact that we're altering the body at birth is just beyond what I can understand. Some people may make a mistake because they haven't thought it through, and sometimes you make a decision in a rush and you regret it. But then when you've got time and you make it again, that's where I start to scratch my head.
Yeah. I sometimes I've talked with people, and you've gotten through all of the excuses that they have, and they still say, "Oh, I'm going to do it anyways." Like, why? I don't know. You gotta have a reason. Yeah, it's frustrating work sometimes. Okay, so all those parts missing leads to multiple problems for those that have endured this procedure. The first one I like to cover is the hairy shaft, typically caused by scrotal webbing. Scrotal webbing being when you got your scrotum down here, right? And when the penis is coming out for an erection, it's pulling, since it doesn't have the skin to unroll down the penis, instead it's pulling the scrotum up the shaft, right? So you end up having the hairy scrotum skin on your shaft instead of your shaft skin like it's supposed to be. And because of that, because scrotum also has the testes inside of it, right? The man's balls. the part that feels really, really bad if you kick them in the balls, that's being pulled up. And I've seen plenty of videos and pictures of guys when they have an erection, their balls are up on the sides of their shaft instead of hanging down low like they're supposed to.
Mm.
And for me, I actually interviewed someone else recently that he had the same issue. Um, I've talked to other people that have had the issue too, but it doesn't happen very often. But in my case, when I was in my 20s and teens, sometimes one of my testes would go inside my body. It would kind of like pop inside my body, and it would feel really horribly uncomfortable, and I had to stop having sex or masturbating or whatever, calm things down, relax my erection a little bit, and then push it back out, and then try to finish.
It's very interesting that you're sharing that, John, because my dad's from a Indian background, my mum's from a Iranian background, and circumcision didn't really become part of the narrative until the revolution occurred in 1978 in Iran, and her parents came. And what became very clear was that the Iranians have a very keen sense that circumcision actually does lift the scrotum. So after I would go and play cricket for hours and I'd come home, if I was sitting on the couch and I was a bit sweaty, and let's say if I was scratching my scrotum, my grandmother would make a very big deal of it and would say, we need to get this boy circumcised because it'll lift the scrotum and he won't sweat as much there and it won't itch. And so they know.
Just tell your kid to go get a shower. I mean, or sit in a bathtub or something for a while. Gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
The phenomenon you're describing is quite well known in the Middle East. We'll put it that way.
There's this movie. It's low quality movie, but it's called The Circumciser, and it's of this guy in India that was Islamic, and he was in a community that was primarily not, and this part of India was being invaded by Islamic people, and they were going around to circumcise all the boys. And this circumciser, the guy that would do the circumcisions when requested or whatever, but he didn't push it on anyone. He defended his neighborhood by going to these people as they were coming to do this and force it on people. He put the Quran on top of his head and said, "Everyone here is already done. I'm the circumciser. I already did it." He lied, but he protected his. Yeah. So that was interesting. Then there's a pelvic floor aspect of this. So the scrotum is on the bottom of the penis, right? The top of the penis goes to the bottom of the stomach, so the pelvic floor. And if you don't have much, skin bunched up here, when you get an erection, it causes the penis to bend upwards instead of going straight out like it's supposed to. And you can look at diagrams of things on the internet. You can find images, and you can see how the corpus cavernosum, or the penis, goes. It stretches all the way from the anus forward, and it's supposed to go in a straight line. And I often compare this to those balloons that they use to twist and shape into animals or flowers or whatever. As soon as you bend it one way, it kinks. So now this is, you're filling this up with blood instead of air, but it's still, even more so, it's not supposed to bend very far when it's all full of blood like that. Now, this causes problems with sexual partners because they might want to have you straight in order to do a certain position or whatever, and if they cause it to bend forward, they end up with like a double kink, and that can really get uncomfortable. There's been plenty of cases where it's like, okay, you can't go that far, come back or whatever.
It can actually cause a serious injury.
Yeah. There are recorded cases where something breaks inside, where the whatever's holding the blood breaks, and then you have a form of internal bleeding.
I've
Good
got
point.
the distortion that you've described with the bending.
Mhm.
I do have a number of friends that I went to university with that did describe that phenomenon that occurred, because I've had a couple of friends who described it to me due to the fact that they felt that too much foreskin was removed.
Yeah.
It's probably more common than what is reported.
Yeah, well, I didn't start learning about this stuff until I was 35, and I didn't put two and two together. I didn't connect all the dots for like over a dozen years later. I kept, figuring out bit by bit by bit. Someone might tell me about an experience or whatever. It's like, or after, thinking about how it's supposed to work and everything, it just kind of dawned on me. It's like, oh, well, that's why I've been having this going on. It's actually not normal for me to have that problem. So so that's why it's not reported often enough. And well, it's also not reported often enough because men might be embarrassed or whatever to talk about their junk. Or
I think that's the main reason, to be honest.
Especially in masculinized cultures where men are supposed to be tough and strong and not cry and all that stuff.
Most people will talk up the fact that they've been cut, talking about the cosmetic benefit, but also the fact that it's been desensitized to a degree, which means that they would have longer duration during intercourse. If you saw the Penn and Teller episode, you'd realize that some of the nerve endings you lose include the ejaculatory trigger. So that could be a myth as well, because of the greater sensation and the greater control. An intact male could actually control the duration in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, I actually have, if we were talking about the frenulum earlier, I have a theory behind that. I think Mother Nature knew what they were doing, knew what she was doing when she, designed the the penis. So, the frenulum being extremely sensitive spot, and it seems to me that that's the spot that gets really sparked up for me when I'm about to reach orgasm. And that's a spot that's being rubbed or whatever when I reach orgasm. For the intact man, different men have different amounts of prepuce still left over after they have an erection, but a lot don't. And when they start having sex, things start rolling back and exposing the frenulum. Right, so the frenulum isn't touching anything except for the inner mucosa until it's inside the vagina or anus or whatever so far. And that's brilliant because you don't want to accidentally ejaculate just that far in, right? Because you're less likely to cause pregnancy. If that's what Mother Nature's aiming to do, is cause pregnancy, right? You want it to get all the way in there and get close to the uterus to inject the sperm into the uterus. Make sense?
It does. And I've got to say, John, that having the slide glide effect during intercourse is very pleasurable for intact men like myself. You're meant to be the one asking the questions, but I'm going to turn this around.
Please.
Being as learned and erudite about this subject as you are, and knowing so much of the detail, which is very impressive,
Thank you.
Fact that it's been removed from you, I can't imagine how this is not very painful for you to detail and know about because of the injury and what's been taken from you. Sorry if that's an insensitive question.
No. So it is painful when I'm dealing with people that don't want to listen, or or mocking me, or laughing at me, or joking at me, or whatever. It can be. I guess I have I've built up a high level of cognitive armor on this after dealing with enough people like that. But yeah, I've gone through my trauma over and over and over again, right? And I'm an introvert normally. It doesn't seem like that when I'm sitting here talking to people about this, but normally I process things inside my own head. I don't need someone to talk things out back and forth to work through my my oops, um, my trauma, my grief. And there's like five steps in the grief process, right? And I didn't have to go through that just once, because I didn't learn all this all at once. And in some ways, I hope that people will watch this and get all at once and get it over with, because it took a lot of time for me to get through it. Because I discovered one thing. It's like, okay, it would have been lubricated, it would have been moist. That pissed me off. It's like, I'd really like to have that. That would be really great. That would have made things different for me in my sexual history. And then I disappear and kind of go inside and not get into the issue again. And all this, during all this time, my wife is out with your whole baby, educating people and all that. So yeah, but what overrides the pain is the positive part of this for me, is that getting this information out there to people is likely to protect the next generation.
Hope so.
And yeah, so I'm very hopeful by doing this.
I've got to say that it feels awkward just talking about how lucky and privileged I am to have avoided the cut, and how I've avoided all of these problems that you've talked about, and how I've gained all the benefits.
Yeah.
And listening to a man who's describing the details and intricacies of what's been lost by a man who's had this painful ancient ritual done to himself. I've got to be honest with you, John, it's a little bit heartbreaking for me sitting here.
Thank you for sharing that, Mark. I really appreciate that. And a lot of intact men have no idea. They haven't really taken the time to think about what they would lose to have gotten it done. I've heard from men that say, well, I kind of wish I would have been cut when I was a baby, whatever, so I won't have to, do it now or whatever, or I'm thinking about doing it because I don't want to take a shower on a regular basis, or it still smells, whatever. They probably having yeast infection or something like that. But it's like I start talking to them. It's like, well, you be giving up on this and this and this and this. And usually when I talk to them, and even in person, I go over that with them, and they just go silent. I think they probably are feeling a lot like what you're feeling. They're stunned at how much they haven't really considered how lucky they are to have it.
So you obviously spared any male offspring of your own.
Yes, I have 2 teenage boys, and I came this close to allowing my first son to be born cut. It's only through the fact that someone shared with us some information, so I'm very thankful for Intactivists.
Who is that lady, Milos? She has been an Intactivist since the 80s. She was on the Donahue program.
Marilyn Milos?
Yeah.
She was on the Donahue program, yeah.
Yeah. Every time I hear her speak and get teary, it just moves me so much. Just the regret she felt and the amount of good she's done since.
Yeah. She's it was her organization that came up with this symbol.
Okay.
It's called International Child of Genital Autonomy. And I work with her. I came up with the idea of the Genital Autonomy Society, with the idea that I wanted to pull the whole set of groups in the world together to help people see how big this movement is worldwide, and how people from all over the globe are speaking out about on this, particularly in Israel. So, yeah. So that's why I include AIGA and Foreskin Revolution from Australia on the map.
And there is some contact between her and Brother Kay, I imagine.
Yeah, they actually live within a couple hours of each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Both very inspiring individuals, I must say, John.
They
as
are.
you are.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I actually a year and a half ago, yeah, about almost exactly a year and a half ago, I drove down the coast from Washington State and stopped and visited Maryland. And then when we were going back up, I stopped and visited Brother K as well in person. So that was very, very good.
So fortunate.
Yeah, I feel honored to be connected with him.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's see, where did we leave off? Okay, we talked about the hairy shaft, the testes, the pelvic floor. One of the side effects that happens, Brian Earp recently tweeted about this. It sounds like there's a very large percentage of cases where boys end up with milah stenosis after having been preputially amputated. And for those of you that don't know what milah stenosis is, that's the meatus is the part where the urine comes out at the end of the penis normally, as long as they don't have that condition where it comes out lower, something like that. But it's the stenosis part is closing up, and that kind of happens because of scarification going on, buildup of tissue, since this part is supposed to be covered and protected, and it's getting a layer of skin on it as the boy gets older. And it seems like the older you get, the less sensitive that becomes because it hasn't been covered. And for me, this didn't hurt or anything, but it was an annoyance. And I have a very vivid memory of this. I had a little skin bridge across my meatus, and when I urinate, it would cause my urine to spread all over the place and make a mess. I was visiting my grandmother one summer, and she wasn't having it, so she took me to the doctor to try to figure out what was going on. And the doctor was like, "Oh yeah, you got a little skin bridge here." So he took a knife and cut it, and I didn't feel anything because it's just scar tissue, right? So, but I do have a very vivid memory of dropping trowel and having the doctor say, "Well, it's really still," and all that. I think that
but there's usually inflammation associated with meatal stenosis as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I'm not, I'm not a doctor. For people that are appealing to doctors, go check out Doctors Opposing Circumcision. I don't know exactly what the definition of inflammation is. I think of my getting a muscle bulge or something like that from an injury being inflammation, blood running to that area, whatever. Whereas I think this is tissue, and I've got a few scars on my body, and so I know what scars feel like and how skin buildup happens and all that. So the idea of skin cells just building up on the glands makes sense to me. And multiple men that have done restoration or used the manhood, they talk about how a lot of skin would slough off, and their glands would reignite again and come alive again, and sensitive again. And like guys that have tried the manhood and they haven't restored, they kind of like become dependent on the manhood because they don't want to leave it off anymore, because since it became sensitive, they don't want it touching their underwear and stuff. And I even did a poll on Twitter one time. Got a good chunk of men that responded, where the question was, for intact men versus circumcised men. Circumcised men, do you like tidy whities or boxers? And then intact men, tidy whities or boxers? Intact men preferred boxers, while circumcised men preferred tidy whities. And my thinking about this is, for myself, I wear tidy whities because I want to have my penis stay close, especially the head, stay close to my body. I don't want it hanging down and having any of this rub against the clothing. Whereas if I had my prepuce, there to protect me, then skin is my skin here, much as sometimes I just don't have clothes on, but my skin here can handle my clothing just fine. One of the times that I often have issues with this is when I'm wearing swimming boxers. So, and the end of my glands will get very inflamed, I guess.
Yeah, I just don't know why there isn't the general acceptance in the United States and parts of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, so-called advanced countries, that the glands is a sensitive part of the body, and it is naturally supposed to have protection. And the fact that it's removed and it rubs against clothing and whatnot, it just beguiles me. It's beyond my understanding how it's accepted that the normal look is for it to be exposed the entire time.
Yeah. I laughed earlier when you said that the guy thought that his penis looked better or whatever because he was, circumcised. I don't feel that way about my own penis anymore. The more that I realize how the natural penis is supposed to work, the more that I find the natural penis beautiful.
Well, in Australia, aardvarks and anteaters are part of the vernacular that children learn, and wrinkled skin on a young man or on a child is just considered unsightly. And it's a natural part of the body, and it's unfortunate that people have been conditioned to think this way.
Yeah, it is. It really is. Okay, so that was melanocytosis. And then we talked a little while ago about skin bridges that occur because, again, the body is trying to heal itself because it expects that that gland is supposed to be covered. So it tries again with a very little bit of tissue that it has left over to reach up there and try to cover the glands by attaching to it, and that's it's done via scar tissue. One of the things that worries me more than a preputial amputation is forced retraction, because the thought here is every time you forcefully retract the prepuce, you're causing micro tears in the glands, and people think that they need to do it in order to clean out inside there, and they don't. But and then when it comes back, the body tries to heal itself, and scar tissue is building up. And if it's done repeatedly over and over and over again, more and more scar tissue builds up. And I'd like to see this more myself. I'd like to see pictures, but then what sometimes happens is they're diagnosed as having phimosis. Well, I think there's two kinds of phimosis. One is where the pectoralis fascia, the ridge band, won't open up. They won't separate. They won't spread out to allow the prepuce to come down onto the penis, right? And then sometimes what will happen is if it is tight and they do manage to get it past the glands, then it won't necessarily go back on top of the glands because it's too tight and it gets trapped behind the corona. Paraphimosis. But I think what also happens is that because they were forcefully retracted, over and over again, every time diaper change or whatever, that it gets attached permanently. And then they have to kind of like go in there and cut it. And then the glands is nothing like it's supposed to be.
Cultures that are used to circumcising, that have stopped circumcising, are very acutely conditioned to think that there is going to be hygiene issues involved with the glands.
Yeah,
I've found it quite interesting that the GPs, general practitioners that I have where I'm living at the moment, who come from countries like the Philippines and the Middle East, who are used to having very high rates of circumcision, their advice to us as parents with infants, children, has always been to forcibly retract for hygiene purposes.
Yeah.
And and the Filipino doctor was saying that you must do it, and that's what should be done. And through my own research, through intectivism, I'm fully aware that this is the major cause of phimosis. The BXO scares that we see so much, balanitis obliterans, is very rare. And even then, I believe if caught early, circumcision is not required. But there are so many mothers that talk about the non-stop issues that they've got with tight foreskin and phimosis, and that they would go back to the doctor, and the doctor would say, well, let's circumcise as a default, rather than using a very light Kenacomb type steroidal cream to loosen the skin. Whereas it was just their lack of knowledge and poor practice that was what's caused the problem. One of those mothers will talk to another 10, and the biggest influence people have is perhaps not their doctors, perhaps not what they read on Wikipedia or other reasonably good websites. It's what their peers tell them. And I fear that this is a great cause of misinformation and baby boys being circumcised. It's the forced retraction is a major issue in countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States that are not accustomed, like in Europe, that you just leave it alone. You clean it externally. There is no need to tear that attached membrane.
Clean what is seen. That's all you need to do. Wipe like a finger. Yeah. I changed my own boys' diapers, and I've changed diapers of preputially amputated boys as well. And I constantly say, I find that cleaning intact penises is actually easier if you know that fact. If you're trying to forcefully retract, you're going to cause that baby pain. I actually saw a daycare worker tweeted one time on Twitter saying, that she would definitely get her son cut because every time you had to forcefully retract that baby, and it always screams and cries, like, you're not supposed to be doing that. So that actually led me to start doing some research, at least in my own area. To I actually called several daycares, like, okay, how do you deal with an intact penis? How do you deal with an intact penis? And luckily, at least in my area, most daycare workers knew to do it right. But I did come across one.
Changing my own son's diapers, or nappies as we call them in Australia, you'd see that the foreskin does have considerable length. And as you said, it does act like a bit of a sphincter because it is rather closed at the end. And you would see that any of the bacteria is far away from the glands as possible. And I think what you said was very fair, that it's actually much easier to care for an intact baby and toddler because you're just wiping the external part and you know that the glands are tucked away and safe.
Yep. Exactly. So let's see, we covered skin bridges. The next thing is erectile dysfunction. And the way I see it, erectile dysfunction is caused by two things. Either something physical is gone wrong down there, and or something is going on up here, which is, I've often heard it say, your brain is actually your biggest sexual organ. And for those men that realize that something is missing down there, or they're starting to have loss of sensation as they get older because keratinization and everything like that, I could see when you're in the mood or whatever, just the thought of that missing that can be a mood killer real fast. So that's why Viagra is such a big seller here in the U.S. So,
and ED is such a ubiquitous issue in Australia, and really the angle they're taking is that the general practitioners are concerned that there is some circulatory dysfunction and possibly a cardiac issue that needs to be looked into. And the research that people like you and I do, it's telling us that it could be due to just the overall loss of sensitivity over the decades.
Yeah. Well, the vascular thing is interesting too, though, because when you look at what's being cut here, you're cutting a double fold of skin, and when you unfold it and you take a look at this, it's like, okay, well, skin from here to here is removed, or here to here, and it just kind of depends on the procedure. Different part of the penis is cut, and you've got those blood veins that are running through that get snipped. So if you cut this, then what is happening? How is the blood getting from here to here now? Or because they're not taking the time and they're not doing microsurgery and looking in and reattaching blood veins to make sure blood is flowing toward the end of the penis.
I hadn't actually thought of that before. So the actual amputation of the prepuce could be interfering with the actual blood supply.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to see more studies into that. I'd also like to just see a study that says, okay, Viagra is being sold primarily to cut guys or not cut guys, or 50-50 or whatever. It would be interesting to see that information. That would be another nail in the coffin of this one.
Just from the anecdotal conversations I've had over the years, it occurs to me that ED is lesser of an issue in Europe than it is in countries like Australia and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's what I understand. That's why I've heard that Viagra sells in the U.S. far more than anywhere else, because we have the highest cut rate next to Israel or Islamic countries, obviously. Okay, so then there's premature ejaculation, and I was discussing that earlier. I haven't seen any solid studies about this, but I was explaining earlier how the frenulum is a very sensitive part, and if it's exposed, the idea is it's getting engaged sooner than it probably should be, supposed to be. So it shouldn't. The thinking here, my theory at least, is that that frenulum doesn't get exposed until it's inside the vagina extensively, right? And then it's getting engaged, and then ejaculation happens and goes in. The sperm goes into the uterus.
So John, most proponents of circumcision would argue that because the gland is exposed, mm-hmm. it will be desensitized to a degree. It would mean that the possibility of premature ejaculation is much less. Yeah. And a remedy for premature ejaculation actually is to circumcise. Yeah. So I'm interested where you're going here. Your theory on the frenulum is a good one, but my understanding is only about half of circumcised men have lost their frenulum.
And it's varying degrees of frenulum, right?
Yeah.
The frenulum isn't 100% ablated. Well, I mean, there's some cases where it's really carved out, but the frenular area that's got the nerves and everything, there's a certain degree of how much frenulum you may or may not have left over.
That's a fair point.
So
it's a really fair point.
That's a challenge with these studies, is there's so many variables to look at when you're trying to put these studies together.
So in your opinion, John, is there a greater chance of premature ejaculation with a circumcised man as opposed to an intact man?
I really don't know. Again, it's just a theory, and I haven't seen really good solid studies on it. And even if there were solid studies on it that really push one way or the other, it still wouldn't justify cutting a child without a medical need.
Of course not. My view is that a intact man has far greater control, and the possibility of premature ejaculation, I think, is quite remote for an intact man.
Yeah. One of the things I hear quite often is that intact men can have multiple orgasms, much like a woman, and they can last longer because they don't get as sore because there's less friction, and their partner can also perform more often through the day because they haven't gotten sore because of the friction.
All of that, in my experience, is true.
Okay. And then the very last item under the physical impacts of this is are the general botches that occur. These cuts can happen. Again, we're dealing with human beings making these cuts, and of course we're cutting a human being. So there's lots of opportunity for mistakes one way or another, and they're dealing with a very small body part when you're dealing with an infant, or even a toddler, 5-year-old, whatever. But if they don't put that clamp on perfectly straight, then you can end up with less skin on one side or the other. So you end up with a penis that ends up curving as it gets erect, because the skin is tighter on one side or another. Sometimes sometimes the penis gets completely amputated. David Reamer is the most well-known story about that. The glands could get clamped off if you're using a Mogen clamp. Even the Plastibell has been known for mistakes happening where they don't put that string on just right, and somehow it pops off and it strangles the penis one way or another and cuts off blood supply. So there's several other genital botches. If people are really interested in seeing this stuff and are okay with seeing images, go out to circumcisionharm.org and look at the many damaged penises out there.
I'm aware that a lot of people who, as children, 8 or 9 years old, when they undergo a freehand circumcision, there are often scars on their glands, just because of the number of clamps and scalpels. And there's quite a few people I know that have told me that they know that a mistake was made because they've got quite a noticeable straight line scar on their glands.
Yeah, it really surprises me that some claim that it's easier to deal with an infant than to cut an adult. And I'm like, well, an adult, first of all, can draw lines about exactly what they want to have removed, not too much, not too little. And the inner mucosa is already separated from the glands typically when you reach adulthood. So you don't have to, reach in there and separate that. And that's, that increases the risk of harm to the glands. They just, all they have to do is, pull back and draw those dotted lines and, cut only so deep, of course, and then stitch it together.
On Australian TV, they keep making a big deal about if it happens as an adult, it is just so painful, and that's why you must do it as a child. And I do debate that because the anesthesia can be controlled, the environment can be controlled.
Exactly.
The only thing that I question is that getting done as a child or an adult, the possibility of scarring is probably a little bit more intense. But then again, there are creams and hormonal type creams that can be used to ameliorate the scarring if done as an adult.
Yeah, the only part that I agree with is that, okay, babies probably heal faster because they're growing. Okay, yeah, they might heal a little faster, and maybe the healing will even be better. You don't know for sure though, but yeah, I agree. A man can be put completely under, so he doesn't feel the actual cut, and when he does wake up, he can take some powerful medication, just stay knocked out until he heals up.
Yeah. The one thing that I have done a little bit of study in, John, is the fact that trauma is actually remembered by the body. It's actually in the cells.
Yeah.
And a lot of terrible things happen to children before the age of 5 years old that they won't remember, but it does affect them. The memory stays with you. And having your genitals operated on, parts of it amputated without anesthetic, and the animal type roars and screams that you hear, I do believe that they won't remember it, but I also do believe that it will impact upon them later in life.
There are, though, some stories like the one from Jay Jackson here, who wrote this book. And I know myself, and then a couple other men that I've heard from had dreams that they attribute to the what happened to them. For some reason, they have memory of it, maybe because of that trauma. That memory sticks with them, or a particular part of the memory. Jay, he talks about how he sees faces in his dreams, and he explains in very serious detail in the book how he came to the conclusion that it's definitely from that procedure being done on him.
See, the science of psychology will tell us that babies that are abused, and it's very sad, but some people do abuse children as young as 1, 2, and 3 years old, and they're telling us that they won't remember it, but it will cause mental illness and it will cause severe perturbation when they're older. So it must be treated, and it must be treated by experts. But yet we can genitally alter them as babies, and we won't worry about the psychological effects. There seems to be a double standard there that I don't understand, John.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't either. Hopefully, we'll get people to call this out and consider it more. Okay, so I think I covered all the physical aspects and all the side effects of the physical side effects of this. Unless there's anything else you can think of, I might have missed.
Well, I just think that, John, there is the issue of intact men during their lifetimes that can experience psychological trauma from being shamed.
Yeah. And that's the section I get. So we just went through the physical, and then the next part is about partnerships, sexual partnerships, and then we talk about the psychological effects.
Okay, sure.
Okay. So all those physical aspects do affect sex. So it impacts the sexual partners as well, not just the person that's been cut. And I was explaining earlier how having that bending penis causes difficulties with being able to do certain acts with a sexual partner. And so it's not just a turn off for me, but it was a turn off for them too. So I'm heterosexual, so I address it that way. And one of the other things that would often happen for me with a couple of my sexual partners is that they would get torn. They'd have a vaginal tear, like around their labia or whatever, because they haven't been lubricated enough before we get started. And sometimes get too excited or whatever and jump into it. And so they would get torn and harmed for this. And even if they don't necessarily get torn at the beginning, because we don't have that prepuce to keep things like sealed. So Dr. Doe, and she has a YouTube channel called Sexplanations, and she talks about how it's like having a docking station, a space dock. It helps keep the lubrication inside the vagina instead of sliding out and in and bringing that lubrication out to dry out. So the longer sex goes, the more dry they become inside the vagina, and that can lead to pain.
And the converse is true for an intact man. The longer it goes, the more emoluments and moisture is present.
Building up. Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. And then we have anal sex. Obviously, most people realize anal doesn't have lubrication built in, but if you're dealing with an intact penis, you have both the rolling mechanism and you have the lubrication that's built in between the glands and the intermucosal. So you can slide into an anus without having to use lubrication. So this actually, I've talked to many gay men in the gay realm, and they talk about how an intact man is kind of like discovery of gold. It's a big deal. So yeah.
I would imagine that there would be a few painful encounters with non-intact men engaging in the gay community.
Yeah, it's interesting. One gay man actually counter protested the bloodstained men, and it's on video, and he got some educating because he had never been with an intact man, so he assumed that he was better off, and that that the bloodstained men were idiots. That's really what his sign was saying, is idiots, and he had an arrow pointing to
Oh,
the guys. So.
that's like showing a red rag to a bull to a group of intactivists, I would imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely an entertaining video to watch. If anyone wants to watch it, it's on the Bonobo 3D channel. And then homosexual docking. A lot of people don't know what this is. Jim Jeffries, he's a popular comedian, actually brought this up. And I love to pick on Jim Jeffries because he picked on us. He picked on the intactivists. He picked on Jonathan Conte. He picked on Elon Cerrone. He actually went and interviewed Elon Cerrone in Israel. And he admitted on air that he had his son circumcised because he loves his son and all that. I ended up protesting in front of a couple of Jim's shows here in California. Anyways, he actually talked about homosexual docking, about how two men come together and they they get connected because they have their prepuce there. So if you don't have your prepuce, all that you have to do is cross swords. So definitely
Is he big in the United States? He's very popular here in Australia.
Yeah, Jim Jeffries is very popular here in the United States, and I think he's in the LA area. So yeah, you can pull up his website, and I think he stopped doing things since COVID started, but I actually have a Google alert on him, so I see an email pop up about what he's doing.
He went to Israel and stood next to an intactivist protesting there.
Yeah, Elon Cerrone. Alon Cerrone, Sivroni. That's the he's quite often the solo protester there in bloodstained pants, wearing cameras, and he'll carry weapons with him because it's dangerous to protest this topic there in Israel.
But he found a sympathetic guy on the street who was kind of agreeing with him, but that still wasn't good enough. I thought that he could have been a little bit more generous on that occasion.
Yeah. There's actually a handful of people that have joined down there, and I just came across a new website in Israel, brimila.com, BRIMILA.com, and the person that put that together actually responded to my email recently. So another new connection to what's going on there in Israel about this topic.
Given the fact that this is such a strong mandate in their scripture and it's genuine, I think we have to be a little bit generous with the Jews, because this is a legitimate part of their faith. And if we try to be very firm and play hardball with them, it's only going to entrench them more. I think over time, to influence them, it's going to have to be through gentle dialogue. That's my view. And we have to be respectful of their faith and their religion.
Yeah, I know many people that will completely disagree with you on that one, but that's okay. I always just keep saying I'm a huge fan of religious freedom, and my religious freedom was stomped on when I was an infant, and I am serving a life sentence.
Are you from a Jewish background, John?
No, my parents are they consider themselves Christian. I went to a Baptist church. I went to Assembly of God, and so I learned a fair bit about Jesus, his teachings and stuff. My wife is Lutheran.
Paul in the New Testament made it clear that this is not a requirement.
Yeah.
So Christians that, and I hear a lot of Americans say that the reason they do it is because it's in the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, they've selectively read the Bible and they're not up to date with it.
Yeah.
So in your situation, I'd say it was a cultural thing that your parents did, a cultural practice. And I do know some Jewish men who are very, very irritated by the fact that this was done to them. I've got a female rabbi here as part of my interfaith group who is against the practice. And I think gentle dialogue is possibly the only way that this is going to change, and it will take time.
Yeah, I know several, I know Reformed Jews will like practice Brit Shalom. There's a guy by the name of Olayu Ungar Sagan. He created the documentary Cut, Slicing Through the Myths of Circumcision. He's one that pushes the Brit Shalom side.
Yeah, and even with our Muslim community, it is just so entrenched that I think an adversarial approach would be counterproductive. It may make intactivists feel better to take that approach, but to win hearts and minds is not always about having a stoush.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, there's certain cultures, and people argue as to whether there's any religious connection here or not. But the female genital cutting goes on, and we have laws against it now in the United States. That law's been back and forth lately, but if you're drawing a hard line with them, why can't we draw a hard line with the Jews? That's the question that keeps coming up. It's like, okay, well, if you allow one, then you kind of have to allow the other, or you kind of have to be consistent. So, and how do you? I brought this up actually in front of politicians in Olympia, Washington, I think their capital, when they were talking about doing an anti-FGM law, and I said, because I had become aware of intersex surgeries, and Brian Earp has a lot of stuff on this, but the point is how do you draw the line between a penis and a clitoris? Right? How do you draw the line between, shaft skin and labia? Because when you start dealing with the intersex people, that's going to be a very, very hard line to try to draw, and it's going to make it very complex when it comes to courts. Whereas if instead you just say, well, no cutting genitalia, actually, it shouldn't even have to be said, any cutting of anyone without a medical need and or consent is illegal.
The trouble the lawmakers have got, John, is the fact that the medical authorities are neutral. And in the United States, they're in favour, even though they don't mandate it. Yeah. But the ones in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're neutral on the subject, whilst saying the FGM does harm and there is no justification. So the argument can get complicated there, where it's widely accepted that there is no justification for FGM, and most people equate FGM to removing part or whole of the clitoris, not just other tissue. Yeah. And the fact that the amputating the prepuce in some situations can be therapeutic, yeah, muddies the waters, whereas there is no therapeutic application for cutting any part of the female genitalia. I think that's where some of the distinctions are.
Well, Brian Earp covers this. He says it quite well. I'll try to not botch up what he said, but you don't want to try to tie anti-FGM to that statement about there not being any medical benefits, because what are you going to do when someone does come up with medical benefits? I mean, all that does is it signals the people that are supporting the practice of cutting female genitalia to go do a study and find out, hey, well, if we remove this labia, we've reduced chances of, I don't know, cancer. Really, when you remove pretty much any body part, you just reduce chances of certain diseases because it's just not there anymore. So
that's a very relevant point, and that's actually a very well crafted argument.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I think we went through all the partnership, the sexual partnership effects, and now we get into the psychological aspects. And you were talking earlier about how babies are traumatized and how it affects their bodies. Like somehow they might not vividly remember it, but I often heard this as it's like if you have a hand cut off or an arm cut off, you your body remembers that, whether you vividly, your body, your brain might not. If your arm was cut off, your brain would still want it to be there, right? So yeah, that kind of limbic memory. Limbic, that's the word I was looking for. Limbic, limbic memory. So some people won't want to call the prepuce a limb, but it's still a body part that the brain knows was there, even though it might have been cut off before. You can create, vivid memories.
And the body remembers. I believe that we retain the trauma at the cellular level.
Yeah.
And the way to ameliorate some of that trauma is to actually have counseling and to just shake it off.
Yeah. It's the human body, biology is just amazing to me. How cells just know to go places in your body to go heal something or whatever. It's like, how do they know? How do your cells know to go swim to a certain part of your body? I don't get how that works. Maybe I'll get to interview a biologist sometime and they can explain it. But yeah, I can see that. How do those cells? Those cells must have some sort of memory or somehow connected to your brain or something. I don't know how it all works, but yeah.
My uncle, who remembers his circumcision at the age of 9, that they came to Australia a few years after that, and he just conveyed to me the trauma of it. And I'm now sitting here more than 40 years later, and we talk about it often. It has dominated the remainder of his life, dealing with the trauma. It completely took over his relationship with his late parents, my grandparents, and it's ruined his life. Many proponents of circumcision would be saying that's why we should do it as a newborn, as a neonatal. But then I would turn around and say, why do it at all? And at least you can remember it. At least you can talk about it. But if it was done to you as a neonatal and it was so deep, there could be some subtle issues that come up that you don't know why. And the trauma could manifest itself in other ways. At least he's got consciousness of it and able to discuss it, even though I don't think he has sought the most productive form of counselling to have dealt with this, because it's still a raw issue more than 45 years later.
I think even you can look at some of my interviews with other men, even when they were cut as babies, and this kind of gets onto the second part of the psychological. It's trauma from the discoveries of the loss or harm. You learn about it, even though you might not have a specific memory of it happening when you were a baby. I often say this too when people say, well, they don't remember it. It's like, that's funny, because every time I look down there and use it, I am reminded that I am missing a valuable body part. Hello. And that whole excuse about, they don't remember it, that sounds a lot like Bill Cosby.
Yeah.
So, yeah, man, I'm sorry to hear about your dad being traumatized by this.
Uncle,
Oh, your uncle, okay. Being consumed by this, and I identify. I mean, here I am doing these interviews and spending a huge part of my life every day trying to figure out ways to educate people about this.
And I imagine that he's talking about it has a cathartic impact upon him.
Mhm.
And the fact that you're using the trauma that was done to you to do some good in the world would help your psychological healing in some way, I would
Absolutely.
imagine, John.
Yeah. Yeah, Jordan Norell, you can look at his channel. He's got a bachelor's degree in psychology, and he put it well one time. I don't remember exactly the words, but something about how some of us have this need to research this deeper and deeper and deeper because they want to master this issue. So, which is, it's a little counterintuitive, because the more that you research, the more you find out, the more that you're disgusted and angry about it happening to you. But here I am, able to talk about it in detail, very clearly. So I guess in some ways I've mastered it, right?
I think you have, and
Thank you.
your knowledge is impeccably high.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have no college degree. Guess I just pay attention and.
You come across as a person with several college degrees, my friend.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So, and then there's suicide. So the trauma from all this can lead to suicide, and I've interviewed a couple people that were related or had in one case a real close buddy, that committed suicide over this, or at
What
least.
was that chap's name? Conti?
Oh gosh.
He
Oh,
appeared
you're
in
talking
the.
about Jonathan Conte?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was a Facebook friend, and when I got the notice about his suicide, that really did impact me. I was very, very sad to hear that.
Yeah, lots of people in the community were.
I was annoyed as well, because he was such a articulate, fine, good-looking man, so much to offer. I was quite frustrated and angry, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've been talking to. I actually also interviewed a guy, I think it was yesterday, where he attempted suicide a year ago. So, and I've got another person that I've been chatting with today. Actually, he's talking about committing suicide down the line here. So, he got in trouble for harassing a hospital, calling them and complaining. So he feels like his.
In Australia, where we are so discouraged from having any conversation that's got to do with anything to do with sex, if any of us were ever to raise this or mention it to a colleague, we can get into enormous difficulty and hot water, as we call it.
Yeah.
And look, that can have a very depressing impact on an individual.
Absolutely.
So I do understand it, but
yeah. Excuse me, just 1 second, Mark.
Sorry.
I don't care. Sorry about that.
No, you're right. Rather than resort to self-harm, they can just take a break. With Jonathan, he always used to express to me how much he hated being circumcised, and he would put that out to the public as well. I don't know if he was restoring, but
yeah. I think for some it's particularly those who are directly affected by this, it's nearly impossible to take a break. It's because it's part of our body. And in this other person's case, it's not just the fact that he's harmed physically, but his life has been drastically affected because he got in trouble with harassing the hospital. So other aspects of his life, and lots of people have been affected, like professionally over this. They lose their jobs, or I honestly, I'm pretty confident that there's been cases where I've gone after a job, or I've tried to pursue a lease for a home or whatever, and suddenly silence. I don't get responses to emails. I don't get return phone calls or anything. And I'm like, okay. They looked up my name on Google. That's all it takes for
There is
me.
the risk of that. There is the risk of that in doing what people like you do. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then again, what are we to do? Are we to be so afraid in society that we don't stand up to what we believe in and what's
Yes.
right? It's a delicate balance.
And my attitude is, if you don't have anything to lose at this point, except your life, then why not stand up and fight more? Not just for yourself, but for all of us. So yeah, so suicide is definitely something that happens, has happened several times in the past, and definitely I don't see an end to it anytime soon. In fact, I think that we might actually see an uptick in it if we don't figure out a way to support people, support men in particular, as they learn and discover about this. I think about,
John, some people would say that the more information that we're talking about the way that it harms and causes reduction in performance and those type of things, that the more awareness that circumcised men will have, that we are actually creating these mental illnesses with these men, with these harmed men, and they would have been okay had they not had the information.
yeah.
So I put that to you.
So the challenge is, how do we stop this from happening to the next generation without giving the information to the men that are harmed? I mean, I personally, the selfish part of me sometimes wishes for blissful ignorance. I wish I didn't know. But on the other side, if I didn't know, my children might not be intact, and they'd be missing out on one part of life that I think they should be able to enjoy. So we've got the next generation over here on one side, and we have the current generation on the other side. Who are we going to protect? You got to protect one. Can't really protect both.
It's always a tricky situation. The more information you give, people will realize, oh my goodness, look at what's happened to me, and then they will become sad. But what you're saying is that to withhold information is really the ultimate psychological game. Better that we give it, but then the challenge now is, how do we support people who will become very saddened by the information?
Yeah. I think one of the first things to do is for people to be empathetic towards people that are complaining. I look at the FGM side of this, and I look at women that speak out, like Heba Deer, for example, who lives, I believe, in the UK, and she wrote a book and all that, and she gets support because pretty much everyone there says, yeah, it's horrible. But if she was back where she was cut complaining, she'd probably get a lot of shame for speaking out or whatever, instead of support. And I could just imagine how that would lead someone down to depression or whatever if they didn't get some sort of support.
Talking about the subject, there is the fear of, why are John and Mark making such a big deal over this issue? It's a flap of skin. Get over it. It's happened to so many. They're just fine. There is a very significant lack of empathy, as you've described.
Yeah. And that's part of what has led me to doing these interviews and putting together videos that describe or explain the harm, because the mainstream media definitely shared, far and wide, practically everyone seems to know how horrible female circumcision is, because they've heard the type that involves infibulation, the husband stitch, and it just disgusts people. Even though that's only it's like less than 10% of the cases that occur, and when it comes to women being cut, it's like 200 million in the world, while there's over 1 billion men that were cut. And and they, in those communities, they often say the same thing. Well, I'm fine. I'm cut, and 80% of the females in those cultures think they're fine and that it's a good thing and all that. Just like probably 80 to 90% of males in the U.S. say the same thing. And when I've been out protesting in bloodstained pants and all that, I'd often get the question, just like, why is it bad though? Okay, well, here you go. Look at these videos and I explain why it's bad. Here's the physical impacts of not having your prep use. And so far, I've had these videos on this one playlist on my channel for months now, and I haven't had anyone challenge any of them. Because to me, it's, you don't have to have a medical study to see that. Any good engineer or mechanic can see, they know how bearings work and all that, and they know how fluid in an engine works with your oil and all that. It's like, oh yeah, hello, this is not complicated. This does not require a study to prove that it harms.
The term that Brian used in the video that you're familiar with, Elephant in the Hospital, he used the term mechanical lubrication. Mm-hmm. And engineers fully well understand what that means.
Yeah. And not a lot of people, not a lot of guys will respond, well, you just got to get your woman wet enough. Okay, you stud, you go. Good for you. You're fine with being, missing your part, and you're just so attractive or whatever, and you're so good with the ladies that you don't have to worry about that lubrication. Good for you. But that still doesn't justify this.
No, the other part that I struggle understanding is the fact that having the procedure done as the default will mean that every man will have a scar on his most intimate part of the anatomy. Yeah. And how is that a good thing? How is that acceptable? It beguiles me. And the fact that you see all these polls in Australian magazines and on Australian media and in the US, that the vast majority of females prefer men who have had the procedure. It means that they want to be intimate with a man with a scar on his most intimate member. Again, it's a very unusual phenomenon.
Cultural conditioning.
Yeah.
If you've been told all your life that it's dirty, but the reality is in female genital cutting cultures, it's been the same thing. She's dirty if she's not cut, or she's at high risk for cheating on you if she wasn't cut, or she won't be a virgin if she doesn't get infibulation done. So she's worthless when it comes time for that family to sell her off or trade her for goats and chickens or whatever.
Yeah.
Yep. Some things are ingrained in us that we're indoctrinated from early childhood throughout life, and then it's really hard to peel that back and say, well, maybe that's a lie. A myth. Okay, so that was suicide. The next part of the psychological effects are on children. You obviously have the children that got cut when they're children, and then I watched one video. I know this is a female, but I watched one video of this girl that got cut, and she screamed and everything like that. And then they continued the video of her after the procedure, and all the adults go on to have their tea or whatever. And the little girl lays down, and you just see her face, and she's just so traumatized. But also on the flip side, I've seen plenty of videos of children that have gone out with protesters like me. I've gone out with my own sons have gone out with me, but they were older by the time they started joining me. But I've seen young children join, and I keep bringing up now I'm blanking on her name, but she went to the UN recently and got really popular for going to the UN and calling out the UN. How dare you? Greta, I think Greta Thunberg.
Greta
So
Thunberg.
yeah, yeah. If you read her dad's story about her, you'll know that before she got to that point, she in school she learned about the problems with global climate change, and she got really, really depressed and withdrawn, and all that. And I guess her dad was really worried about her. And then one day she went out and held a sign. I don't know what the sign said, but she got her voice and started sharing it with the world on a sidewalk. And that escalated and escalated and led her to the UN to make her speech. So well, on one side, I really feel bad for my own children and these other children that have to face this reality that our world is still broken after all these thousands of years. Humans are not kind to each other. I don't necessarily want to shelter my own children, and I want them to learn that they have a voice and their voice is valuable.
Yeah, I think as parents, our passions influence our children, and I was discussing the subject with my kids the other day, and it surprised me that my 11-year-old and 9-year-old, two boys, knew how passionate I was about this subject, and it was oblivious to me that I had talked about it often with them, but obviously I had.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, my two boys have impressed me left and right on this. They've obviously heard me, seen me, and they've seen some of the stuff online on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. My oldest son, he actually jumped to the gun one time, and this group of people were shaming me for being out there protesting with my sons, and my oldest was like, "Oh, I'm very happy that my dad is speaking out for this." So, and they shut up.
How precious.
Yeah, it was really great
Wow.
for me. And
Wow.
my youngest son, he regularly jumps on. I had the chance to join me and hold the signs that say circumcision arms or whatever.
Yeah. How
And
brilliant.
and they're both, when they see some of these excuses and stuff that people use for doing it, they're stunned, they're disgusted. You just see it in their faces, like, no, just no. And then we have the psychological effects on medical professionals. I worry about this one and a lot too, just like I worry about men realizing the harm. There's some regret medical professionals. Dr. Christiane Northrup, she's very busy on social media and stuff like that, and she speaks out. She said she apologizes for what she used to do, and calls it out now and says it's wrong. We shouldn't be doing this to children. But yeah, medical professionals in general, if you've seen the videos and stuff where they talk about this, you can see that you know they get a little emotional about this. They also struggle with dealing with their peers that push it, or working in hospitals or whatever where it's happening. I personally, I couldn't imagine working in a hospital. I'd probably get myself in trouble. I'd probably kidnap a kid. Just to protect it.
There's a retired general practitioner who's a good friend of mine near where I live, and he had 10 kids. About 6 of them were sons, and all intact. He's done a lot of rural practice in Australia in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, at the time when circumcision was ubiquitous, and he was required to do them.
Oh.
And they would bring babies into his practice, and he hated the practice. Wow. And he's in his 80s now, but he's told me that it's one of his great regrets that he couldn't talk them out of it. But it was part of the system, and my heart really went out to him, because he was ahead of his time in so many ways, and he knew this was wrong. He knew it was unnecessary. He knew it harmed, but yet against his own conscience, he had to do this procedure to unconsenting babies.
Wow.
And he expressed it to me 30, 40 years later, but I wonder what impact it really has on him deep inside.
I bet. I kind of wonder, I mean, would he have had his license taken away from him if he wouldn't have done them?
There would have been complaints, and he would have had to have been in front of the college.
Yeah.
And there would have been ramifications that another doctor had to come in because this doctor refused.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just wrong to make that kind of requirement. That's sad. There's another medical professional that I've seen her picture on the back of the Intaction mobile billboard. She holds a sign and says that she apologizes.
God bless her.
Yeah, sure. And then we have the psychological effects on the parent. And we have many regret parents in the movement. Rosemary Romberg, rest in peace. She passed away a year ago. I wrote a book on it. Marilyn Milos, you brought her up earlier. She's also a regret parent, but she's been involved in writing several books, which I happen to have up there on the bookshelf with me.
When I started off in the movement, there was no internet. Libraries didn't have a lot of books on it, and it was really only some journals and some books. So I'd spent a lot of time in bookshops looking up indexes, and the main source of information was actually in hard copy magazines. And in the early 90s, really the only source of information I had were articles that were either by or interviewing Marilyn.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's why they, call her the grandmother of the movement.
Yeah.
As a parent myself, who came really close to allowing my oldest son to get cut, I just the thought of that, sometimes I just think about that a little bit, and it just makes me sick. It really goes down in my gut, and I just really, I'm embarrassed by that fact that I didn't think to research this. Luckily, my wife was, well, both of us, we were just going along with society and the doctors and all that. And we trusted the doctors. We figured doctors know best, right? And they wouldn't be doing this, if it wasn't for a good reason or whatever. And come to find out, there's no good reasons.
Some of these women reach out to me when I write kind comments to them, and they call me via Messenger. And look, I get teary. They just tell me that they regret it every day, that they don't stop thinking about it ever. It's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, and that's what drives a lot of them to become activists or advocates. And a lot of times I'll get into a conversation online, and someone will say, "Well, why is it all just women that are trying to defend the penis? I mean, they don't even have a penis." It's like, well, here's the reason why men don't want to talk about it. Because and it's true about victims. Period. You look at the female side of this, and Heba Wardier, she showed how. She shed a tear one time talking about it, and she's like, I hate talking about this, and that's why she wrote a book, because then that's why Jay Jackson wrote a book, because he doesn't want to relive his victimhood every single time.
These women are extraordinary, and I think they're modern day angels. When we're being told that Me Too matters, that crimes and harassment and abuse is conducted by men, there are these majority of women who are spending so much of their emotional time and energy advocating for men's rights.
Yeah.
I think it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I think men like you and I, it's a privilege for us to know some of these women.
It is, yes. there's this thing that Jesus said, what you do for the least of these, you do for me. And that through this movement, I started realizing how that applies to me, because I'd often see these women and other advocates, but they would speak out for the rights of a child on this topic. And I felt like they were talking for me. They were protecting me. It warmed my heart.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
does every single time. I
Hmm.
am very thankful for intactivists. I can't say that enough. If it wasn't for someone giving the information, taking that risk, and giving that information to my wife, who could have been very adamantly, violently, vehemently for circumcision, and might have fought tooth and nail with whoever and argued with the other person, she didn't, but she could have, and the person took a little bit of risk by giving her information. I am thankful for people that are brave enough to do that. So yeah, parents are psychologically impacted. I think even those who deny that they did any harm to their children are, they've got it. I've seen a video of one guy talking to his mom and complaining, and his mom, was like denying, oh, you're not hurt or whatever, justifying it left and right or being defensive or whatever. Clearly that person, that mom, is still being psychologically affected by it. She, her own son was complaining. So it's got to affect her somehow, whether how much she thinks she's right or not.
I've seen some of those videos as well. And what's a very interesting phenomenon is that they're very dismissive and they don't want to detail in any way how they feel about it. They're just dismissive about the fact that this is nothing. And you see a very strong cognitive dissonance there where they're not wanting to reflect on it. And what I'm seeing is that it's too painful for them to explore.
Yeah, and I think also the fact that they don't see or hear very many men complaining is just another reason to just ignore their own child or whatever. It's like, okay, well, I don't see a whole bunch of men, I don't hear about a whole bunch of men complaining about this. So thank goodness for books being written where men are complaining, or men out there protesting with bloodstained pants and all that. A lot of people they assume that those men out there with the bloodstained pants are actually intact men complaining, or trying to say that we want other men to be like us, to have their whole have that foreskin or whatever. It's absolutely wrong. It's a whole gamut of both intact and preputially amputated men protesting to try to protect the children.
And I think that they're both cohorts are legitimately passionate.
Absolutely. Yeah. So guys like me, I actually have a group on Facebook called Intact Male Intactivists. So I've got a whole group of intactivists, and I can pose questions on there to try to get clarity about how the male prep use works, and whether these myths are right or wrong and whatever. And it's a publicly viewable group, so people can go look at the discussions there to hear it right from the horse's mouth per se. And we're very thankful for men like you and Michael Winnell and others who are intact and help dispel these myths. It really kind of blows my mind that these myths were allowed to elevate to where they've become in the first place. That I would have thought that intact men 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago would have said, this is bull, stop using those myths for justifying this. But I don't know, maybe they were just too afraid to go against the grain, or or come across as anti-Semitic or whatever. I don't know why men didn't speak out more back then.
That's often puzzled me as well, and I have thought about that.
Yeah, which actually leads me on to the last psychological effect is on intact men. I've heard of some intact men have told me, they felt shame growing up that they, had the prepuce and their buddies didn't, and actually thought that their buddies were better for it for whatever reason, or that their buddies were included in a ritual or whatever, and they felt left out. When it's actually flip-flopped. It's like they're the lucky ones because they got to keep everything down there.
Yeah, look, the foreskin shaming has been an unfortunate chapter in my life, a very significant and deep chapter in my life, John. And the very sad realization is that in a country like Australia or the United States, either way you lose. This is the conclusion I've drawn, that if you get cut, for all the reasons that we've chatted for the last 90 minutes, that the physical, the trauma, and the psychological effects are there. But if you've remained intact, you'll be shamed when you become of age by females that are expecting you to be circumcised. So for me, I had a fiance, and she lived in another city, so it was a phone type relationship. In the early 90s, we had a program on TV that started at night when the kids go to bed. It was called Sex, hosted by a very famous girl at the time, Sophie Lee. And one of the episodes was on circumcision. And this started a discussion between myself and the young lady. And she wanted to know what my status was. I was reluctant to give it up because she said that the pictures she saw on the sex program, they were disgusting, they were gross, and the argument became that if you're not circumcised, you will get an infection and you're passed on to me. And for the next 2 years, the argument was, if you really loved me, you'll get cut.
Yeah.
And my response was, if you cared about me, you'd accept me for what I am.
Yeah.
And that was a very, very traumatic experience I'd had. And the breakup of that very painful, psychologically painful relationship put me onto the path of intactivism.
Thank you for sharing that story. It's I'm really sorry you had to go through that. But
thank you.
This right here shows that even if you're not cut yourself, you're still a victim of these genital cutting rituals in the world. And yeah, that's so sad that misinformation is put out there. I mean, yes, of course, it's possible that there's an increased chance of diseases by having or keeping that body part, but hey, there's increased chances that I'm going to have toenail fungus and athlete's foot and a gout because I cut my toes.
Yeah. So really, the only silver lining in that was that during those 2 years of arguing back and forward, I became a voracious reader of everything to do with the subject, and I would put arguments to her, but nothing was good enough. The answers are, it's gross, it's infected. When a baby is born, she just had a nephew that was born, and she said it's the most natural thing that they cut the umbilical cord and you cut the foreskin, you cut both things. It's the most natural thing. And obviously it would force me to research. So by the time I had my own children and faced again, the Middle Eastern pressure from my wife's family, and as I told you before, from the hospital staff, from the GP, and from the ongoing child maternal care process that we underwent, that it was that earlier knowledge and intactivism that I was able to stand very firm to protect my boys. So if there was any silver lining, if there was any positives, it's the fact that I was able to protect my own boys and hopefully have impacted upon those around me. And there's been a number of other families that I've been able to help, share, educate, and guide them gently So despite the trauma, some good's come of it. And despite your own trauma, you're doing a lot of good work yourself, John.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's wow. And good job on protecting your sons. That's great. How old are they now, if you don't mind sharing?
11 and 9.
Yeah, that's right. You said that right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sweet. Great years.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll move on to relationships. One of them you just already kind of covered, but we'll get into that in a second. First of all, is a child-parent trust. And the thinking here is that, if the child-parent trust bond the child-parent trust can be broken pretty much right away, because babies are, they're expecting something or they're needing something or whatever, like they're taken away from mom and put down on a board or whatever to be cut, and they get cold or uncomfortable or whatever, and they cry, and no one comforts them. Well, there's one break of trust. And then something happens to the genitalia, they start crying, they don't get what they need, trust continues to break down, right? And then as the child gets older and they start discovering the problems with this, and they try to talk to their parent or whatever, and the parent shoves it underneath the rug or whatever, again, child-parent trust is being broken. And then we've seen cases where, teenagers and older people would confront their parents about this, and parents will get defensive or dismissive or whatever. More child-parent trust being broken. And as a parent myself, having my kids trust me is extremely important to me.
When I talked about this subject to my eldest boy, he said to me, "Dad, why do parents let them do this to their babies?" It was just an obvious, innocent question, and I think he raised a good point. It's a wound, it's an injury.
Yeah,
leaves a scar.
Yeah, but people, too many people don't think of it as a wound or harm. So, yeah. And then there's the co-parenting part, and you talked about how you got into it to try to protect your sons with the mother of your sons. It often leads to divorce just over this one issue. Things get heated and escalated, and people get divorced over it.
So obviously, with the fiance, the arguments were that if we were lucky to have a son, she was adamant that it was going to be cut. And so years later, when I did get married, that was obviously one of the first discussions I had. And it's a non-negotiable with me, because if we can't come to a conclusion there, it's a deal breaker.
Wow. Good for you, standing your ground. I just imagine a world where these ritual genital cutting weren't going on. That would be one last thing to get in, to be a wedge in between us, in between parents, in between, intimate relationships.
Because it's becoming less common in Australia, it was like higher than the United States in the 50s and 60s. It was bordering 100%, to be honest with you. The only kids at school that weren't cut that I knew of were the ones that immigrants from Europe, because Australia also has very high immigration type culture. Already some of the younger people are saying that this is either a Jewish practice or this is a barbaric thing that they used to do to babies. Yeah. I think America's probably 20 or 30 years away from having that view that this was a barbaric practice in the past. And the illusions that you're making, I think, are very reasonable, that this is some type of ancient genital scarring ritual that we're still justifying today. Yeah. It should blow our mind.
Yeah. I always respond when people say, "Oh, it's a medical practice." It's like, no, it's not. It's not a medical practice. It's at best, it is cosmetic surgery, at best. So yeah, sir, you can have a trained surgeon do it, but it's still, that does not make it medical. Medical means that there's a medical indication. There's some sort of diagnosis. Being born male is not a diagnosis, right?
Which is why I tend to be a little bit generous with the Jews that I know,
Mhm.
because they will just say, this is not a medical thing. It is just our belief.
Yeah, it's
And I feel that that is being an accurate and genuine position.
yeah. At least they're admitting that it really is a ritual.
And they're
And
being honest, which I think is fair.
yeah, yeah. Some people will claim that it became religious because, somehow God saw that there is a medical benefit or whatever. But I don't know. That seems like a stretch to me. But
Yeah.
and then there's the mother-child bond aspect to this. My wife is actually a trained doula, and it's often come up that babies need to be bonding to their mom for a good while after they're born, skin to skin contact and breastfeeding and all that sort of thing. Continuing to coo and talk to the baby and stuff like that, because typically mothers will talk to the baby while the baby's in the womb. So there's that connection that continues. And to be taken away, I'd have go through a surgery and then come back and be in pain and not be able to breastfeed or whatever because of the pain. That kind of breaks down the bond on both sides too. I think that mothers feel more disconnected from their babies when that's happened. I often see where women that have both daughters and sons, they're more connected to their daughters.
It's an interesting psychological phenomenon that I've read about, that when mishandling, accidental mishandlings cause babies injury, whether they're males or females, that some of the research I've read says that there is a level of disconnect because of just the trauma for the mother, the fact that there has been some injury that's occurred to the baby.
Mm-hmm.
And it would make sense that if every time they're changing the diaper, they're seeing this red raw injury, or remembering that it's occurred. And if you've ever seen a baby well after it's healed, changing the diaper of a baby that's maybe 8 months or a year old, it just looks deformed and botched. And seeing that every day, knowing that you're responsible for that, I think it's natural that there would be a level of disconnect.
Yeah, we even see this in nature, right? If a mother's baby is tampered with too much by scientists or whatever, the mother abandons the baby.
That's a very good clue, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, then there's pedophilia, and there's multiple theories that go around on this, but I haven't really seen any solid studies on it. But it's still, they're plausible theories, right? There's been talk about nurses who would say that the butcher, the doctor, surgeon, whoever, would get an erection while doing this to children. But I have one particular theory about it, and not everyone agrees with me on it. But if the male is missing a significant amount of his erogenous tissue, then what's left is the feelings of pressure. Right, you don't have the sensation from the Meissner's corpuscles, the lighter touching, and the friction and everything, from the touch of the vagina or whatever to the skin. That's diminished severely because you're missing that erogenous tissue. What's left is the squeezing, right, the pressure. So that leads a man to desire tighter vaginas or other tighter orifices, whatever, to get them to finish. And from what I've heard in the U.S., one of the a growing surgery that happened that women choose is they'll choose labiaplasty or whatever, and things to tighten up that vagina. I've also seen, like in movies, how women talk about doing those Kegel exercises to make things tighter for their partners or whatever. The idea is that girls or young women, however you want to put it, wherever you want to draw the line, have tighter vaginas because they haven't gone through birth or just haven't gotten older or whatever. I don't know. How much truth there is to all that, I'm not sure, but that seems to be the belief that I've come across. So that would give reason for men to be more attracted to younger girls.
I think that some of my friends who have been who have had the procedure done to them as infants do express to me that there's a great preference for a tighter vagina, for them to feel the enjoyment and arousal. But thankfully, none of them have expressed interest in very young females.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that there's a correlation, because I think that, we're discussing serious criminal behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
There's some people out there that hate pedophilia so bad they like, lynch the guys up or whatever, if they've committed pedophilia. They absolutely hate it. And I bet you $100 you come across a lot of men out there that absolutely hate pedophilia, but also still think that circumcision is a good thing. So it's like, okay, well, you want to help in pedophilia? Help in these genital cutting rituals.
Yeah. I'm not. I'd have to look into it, but I'm not aware of any correlation. But I'm very much against both.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm sure you are. Yeah. I again, I haven't seen any studies. I don't know if anyone has even considered doing any studies on this. It would be kind of challenging to do a study on this. To try to prove that theory. I put it out there and what people think.
It's to do with the medical authorities, as I said before. Society has, in Australia in particular, has a very strong tolerance towards people who choose to amputate the prepuce of their babies and their sons. But look, pedophiles are universally condemned.
Yeah, for sure.
As they would be in the United States.
Yeah, but there's plenty of countries where it's not condemned, and there's countries that actually directly support forced marriages of young girls. And when you correlate that, you think, okay, everywhere where they do this forced marriage thing is also places where, or at least cultures that do genital cutting rituals. Hello, connection.
Yeah. As you said, somebody would have to look into that.
Yeah. I'd love it if someone pointed out to me a culture or a group or whatever that does the forced marriages of young girls, or they don't do the genital cutting. I haven't found one, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
I think these are Islamic countries which are relying on two different traditions that bring that to the bear. And these young girls that are forced into those marriages, it does ruin their lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one could argue that men who have been profusely amputated as babies, whilst there are profoundly negative impacts on them, they can still go on to live reasonably normal lives. So,
yeah, something to think about.
It is.
All right, and then there's another relationship, and that's the relationship between the doctor and the patient.
That's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah. So personally, I can't have a doctor that works with me that supports, promotes, or does this practice of cutting children's genitals without a medical need. Because if they could break the Hippocratic Oath there, then what will they do when it comes to my treatment?
I think that what happens there, John, is that they compartmentalize circumcision with every other surgery they do. But in the part of the world where I live, there's a lot of immigration of doctors from the Middle East.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a religious, cultural, strong connection with the practice, and they're very happy to do it. There's a few surgeons in Melbourne, which is not far from where I live, where there's a few Jewish doctors that do the rounds of all the private hospitals, and they're the ones that do the circumcision of newborns. So obviously for people that it's part of their culture and what they're used to. In fact, what has to be done with these doctors and what they do is that they will tell them that when you're a general practitioner, it's okay for boys to be intact. And some of the GPs that I take my sons to are telling me that, wow, these are things that we're learning, that some boys are intact in Australia. So it's very interesting. But you raised an interesting question, that there are many doctors, surgeons, that shrug their shoulders and will say to people that it is unnecessary, but if you want, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And how does that happen with educated, responsible, and I'll say it, good people? There is a contradiction there of sorts, which you're bringing to my attention right now.
Yeah. I my last primary care physician was actually raised in Egypt as a Christian, but he was raised in Egypt and he came here to practice. And I'm always wearing shirts like this. I'll go to the hospital, and now I even have a your whole baby face mask. So everyone knows that I'm an advocate for genital autonomy, but it's pretty clear that people will they just avoid the conversation with me, and I brought it straight up with them. It's like, this is really interesting that you're from Egypt. I kind of actually picked you out of the group of doctors in this place because you are from Egypt, and I know that in Egypt, female circumcision is still very prevalent, very popular. Most recently, supposedly they've got laws against it now, but I think it's still happening behind closed doors and all that. And he just absolutely wouldn't talk about it. So
really,
yeah, but here's an interesting thing. I attend these meetings, international group called the Bodyguards. It used to be called International Coalition Against Sexual Mutilation, and we actually have people from Egypt joining us and talking, and they're advocating for genital autonomy.
wow.
One's actually a doctor from Egypt. So yeah,
I do think that a very positive part of that narrative is that when we are going to stop the cutting of young girls, let's talk about boys as well, and let's just stop doing both.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a very positive issue, and I think that with all due respect, because I am a fan of many things American, that they refer to a lot of practices that occur in Africa and places like Egypt and call them barbaric. Well, I'll use an Australian term and say, hey, mate, what about what you do to your own boys?
Exactly. Absolutely.
Sorry to be so confronting, but
no, I totally with you. Being the fact that U.S. is like the second highest cut rate currently, it makes me extremely sad. But when I look at how we have a capitalistic healthcare system compared to a very socialistic healthcare system in other countries, it kind of makes sense, right? Because these hospitals and doctors are making money from it, so they don't want to face the possibility that they can cut out that revenue.
but also they've exported the practice to countries like the Philippines and Korea. And so while the rates are dropping in the United States, it's conversely not dropping in those countries.
Yeah.
And that's due to the shaming impact.
Yeah, well, I understand that the Philippines actually do a different kind of cut. It's not a preputial amputation; it's another kind of cut, and then they somehow pull it down and hold it and make it stay behind the glands. I haven't seen actual pictures of it or any kind of documentation on it, but that's what I've heard. I've seen some pictures of boys. They do it when they're older. Boys laid down and lined up to get this all done to them, but I haven't seen any details of exactly what the cut is. There's actually a guy
the
on
the Thule is a significant cut, John.
Yeah, I know. I do know that's a significant cut. I just don't know exactly how it compares to what what is primarily done elsewhere. But there's actually one guy on Twitter who spoke out about this one time, and he got horribly attacked by his fellow Philippine followers about this, and they use the word supot, S-U-P-O-T, which supposedly means something about dirty penis or whatever. So yeah, it seems like it's extremely heavily ingrained there, and it's
the Filipino friends I've got who are anti-Thule are just saying that you have to leave the country because the humiliation is so strong. John, I was having a chat last week with a very good friend of mine who's Australian now, but he's from Kenya. And he's telling me that when he has sons, they will be cut because when he visits Kenya, the people talk. And he's going to cut them. So then when they visit Kenya and when the boys talk with the other boys, that they won't be shamed and humiliated.
Yeah. Well,
that's the only reason he's going to do it.
Yeah, I hear you, and I get that social pressure is a very powerful motivator. But there are people in Kenya and other places in Africa that are fighting back, that are protesting stuff like that. I have some pictures from there's a guy by the name of Prince Maloba who has been leading up a lot of efforts to protest, particularly the BMMC thing, where the U.S. has been going into voluntarily, circumcised to help try to reduce the HIV rates. But various studies have found that it hasn't been working. In fact, it could easily cause the opposite, make the HIV rates worse.
I wonder how the practice can stop in South Korea. I think that'll be a tough one.
Maybe if North Korea visits them more often, or North Korea is intact and they're doing just fine, so and they're getting to enjoy all their bits. I don't know. I haven't come across a South Korean yet that's speaking out about this. So maybe someday, maybe someone will watch this and say, "Hey, I know someone in South Korea that's leading the charge," or whatever. That'd be great. Then I can add them to the Genital Autonomy Society map.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems very clear that they didn't start doing this until after the Korean War.
Correct.
Which created the North and South, and the U.S. introduced it to them.
Yeah. And now they make a lot of money from it for cosmetic products.
Yeah. Watch the Ellen video on YouTube of Sandra Bullock about the penis facial.
And an Australian actor, Kate Blanchett, is also a promoter of that product as well.
Yep. Yeah. And then you've got Oprah with the Skin Medica things. Yeah. We need more big names like that speaking the other side of this.
People like Cameron Diaz.
Alan Cumming from The Good Life. He works with Intact America a good bit. Tosh Point, Penn and Teller, Adam Ruins Everything. Yeah. There's some big names, but yeah, we need to tip the scale somehow.
Yeah.
I guess it's pretty tough to compete with Oprah.
I know. Andrew Wang is not as big as Oprah, is he? No.
Yeah, I guess not yet. That's an interesting one too, with Andrew Yang. That's I was right there in the thick of it too with
yeah.
with Jellyfish Rave. That's the person. I guess his real name is Pat. Um, he was the one that made the question to Yang
Okay.
that got the answer. So
Oh well.
yay, Pat.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was I'm still connected. He follows me. I follow him. And all that. So.
Yeah.
All right. So the last relationships that are that I've got on the list that are affected are between friends and family, and you can also include. I've been noticing this lately is coworkers at work. If you decide to bring it up at all, but a lot of times, coworkers become friends and they start following you on Facebook or whatever, and you're out there, putting up posts about how this is so bad and all that, and who knows, it might get back to work and
Yeah.
create fights or
Yeah. Yeah. Look, it's caused friction between myself and some family members, some in-laws who are very strong advocates who were very disappointed in my outlook on the subject. There have been some colleagues that have thanked me because it's changed what they were going to do.
Yeah.
And there was one colleague who I very, very gently mentioned it, who made a very big issue of it and tried to counsel me that, I shouldn't be speaking about these subjects. And I found that to be remarkable because I only made a very, very general allusion to the subject matter.
Yeah.
But some people can be very sensitive and some people can be very appreciative.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the sort of thing that's driven a lot of people to be anonymous in this movement. They'll be keyboard warriors, whatever, and they'll use a different name.
Yeah.
I even know one person that he goes out and protests outside, but he still uses a different name when he shares his name outdoor protesting. So actually, I know a couple guys.
The backlash reaction is real. Let's face it.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty sad. And supposedly we have freedom of speech, but that still doesn't keep us from getting fired from our jobs or disconnected from friends and family, shut out by friends and family. It's pretty sad.
It is. Yeah. Raising it with some people that I know has caused friction in the past, and I suppose has impacted on the friendship to a degree.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it touches on so many taboos. So it's yeah. Like I said earlier, I've had people just shut me out and stop talking to me or block me on social media or whatever, and they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to do the debate back and forth or anything. I don't know if that's because they know that they can't argue with me about this because I know so much about it. I don't know.
Yeah, but also look, I'm a rather large person of Middle Eastern appearance, fairly extroverted, reasonably articulate. So when people find that they disagree with me, they would rather not engage.
Yeah. Don't know what that's all about. It'd be nice to hear about. But no one seems to want to tell us, why they don't want to engage.
Yeah.
All right, then the next major section is about connecting this to connecting male genital cutting along with female genital cutting along with intersex normalization surgeries. There's this weed that I got my son to draw it out, and then we colored it in and put words in it and everything like that. And it's a 3-leaf weed, kind of looks like a dandelion, and people got a little irritated because dandelions are good weeds, but it's not meant to be a dandelion. But so each leaf is for the different parts of this. You got your female circumcision, you got your intersex normalization surgeries, and you got the male circumcision or whatever. And at the bottom of the root, or the end of the roots, you have a few different roots, and it mainly comes down to control, right? All these practices come down to primarily one thing, control. But there's also the economics aspect of it, right? So when I compare male circumcision and female circumcision, they both have economic roots. In the U.S., you've got your cosmetics companies, you've got your sex lube companies, you've got the medical industry, obviously too. You've got the pharmaceuticals. You've got all these companies, all these industries that kind of sort of depend on this continuing to bolster their revenue. And then in a lot of cultures that do the female side, they have to pay their moils, and they use the term moils even though they're not Jewish. They're, it's something else, but they still use the term moil just like they do in Judaism. And then you have the families that have to sell their daughters. It just disgusts me that they do this, but this is something that is part of their culture still. From it's been going on for thousands of years, and in order to be able to sell their daughter, they have to have them fixed. So again, that's a kind of a money thing. They might, instead of be trading cash, they are probably trading goats and cattle and chickens or whatever for their daughter, so they can feed the rest of their family when they trade off their daughter. But or there might be I guess in some cases it's like a dowry that goes along with getting married, and you can't get married to someone, they won't choose you or whatever because you're not generally cut. And you can watch several documentaries. There's a YouTube channel, YouTube playlist by Cliteria Nipples that has several videos where each video seems to cover a different culture because they have different practices. Sometimes the girls are cut really young. Sometimes the girls aren't cut until like they're 18 or 16 or whatever.
So really, with the FGM space, the fact that there's laws against it in all Western countries and interventions are being made in Africa and the Middle East is a good thing to stamp out the practice.
Yeah.
And really the challenge is that how can we dovetail the cutting of male boys to give some feedback to the US that what you're doing is also very much not okay.
Yeah.
That's really where this space is.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of people that are worried about making it illegal because, like other things, it might just force it underground, and then when it's forced underground, then it's not regulated and not as safe or whatever. And then it seems to be a very common belief amongst intactivists or genital autonomy advocates that as long as male genital cutting goes on, female genital cutting will continue to go on too. Brian Earp puts it well, how they often say that FGM is due to inequality. Right? That it's an attempt to oppress women, oppress women's sex. Well, same thing can be said about male genital cutting too. Can't remember where I was going with that, but yeah. So one of the beliefs is that female circumcision started out of male circumcision because the females should be included too, right? If males are getting closer to God because they're getting their genitals cut, well, women want to be included in that too. They want to be closer to God as well, so let's get their genitals cut.
There's clear historic linkages with what you're saying, but because of the variance in the procedures that's done on females, and my belief is that the surgical intervention to females is worse, in my opinion, over the broad spectrum. So given the fact that the cutting of girls grew out of the matrix of the cutting of boys, I think that what the opportunity now is that the banning of the cutting of girls, we can jump on the coattails of that to very much diminish the cutting of boys. And I'm out of step with the intactivists around the world. I think that we should generally let the Jews and Israel be, and very gently counsel them. And if around the world, rather than 30% of the males getting cut, if it's like 1 or 2%, I'd actually be okay with that.
A lot of people, a lot of anti-FGM folks are very animate that no, you stay off my coattails. They are. I think what it is they're afraid that including males for genital autonomy reduces the view of female genital cutting as being harmful. And I don't see it that way at all. In fact, I see it as quite the opposite. I have become more of an advocate for female genital autonomy, particularly. It doesn't happen much in my country, but I've become more of an advocate. I've become more aware, more familiar with the kind. There's like 4 types of cuts, according to the WHO. I've become more aware and I've become more educated on the topic, that I've been able to speak out against it more, and because of what I've learned about male circumcision. So I think including it all makes us all stronger and bigger together. One of the things
the same is true of me too, by the way, John.
Yeah. So I think that it's good for the anti-FGMers to include male circumcision, because it kind of acts like an upward spiral for people, because you just start digging into it and you learn one thing after another about it all. I often I got these images of people protesting one or the other, right? People, particularly in the United States, got all these people protesting against male, circumcision, or supporting genital autonomy, and they're trying, some of them will try to include, genital autonomy for everyone, and then I've got like some images of intersex advocates for genital autonomy, and I've got images of people protesting against FGM, and I often think, well, if we were to bring all those people together into, all at the same time, how much bigger that would look, and how much more impactful that would be to see that many more people in front of the White House or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I think that the 3 issues are very different. FGM is clearly barbaric, and the ones that do it know that this is against the will of all the governments in the world. I think the cutting of boys, many people in the United States, Philippines and Korea do it for cultural reasons. Many of them are uninformed about it. With the intersex space, the numbers would be much lower, and I think the possible motivation for that would be driven by the binary indication of what genders should be.
Well, sometimes people just, all that they care about is the looks. They want, like some parents will say, well, I want him to look like his dad, or I want him to look like his peers or whatever. So it's a looks thing, right? And sometimes the same thing is used. They want that vulva to look cute or whatever. Same excuse for the intersex. We want him to have, a larger penis instead of a micro penis, or we want her to, not have such a big clitoris, look more like a female. It's looks. It's all, so it's the same excuses across the board. But as far as the severity that you're discussing, there's a whole range of different kinds of cutting that happens to females. There's actually a range for males too, but For females, you've got anything from a ritual neck, right, where they draw a straw, drop of blood, and as far as I understand, that's all that the Dawoodi Borwa do, and that's what they got in trouble for in Michigan, and the federal judge ended up dropping it out. And then you go all the way to the worst part, which is infibulation and full removal of all the external genitalia. And I don't think anyone's going to argue with anyone that, yeah, that's horrific, you know. But as long as we keep getting bogged down into debates about which one's worse, we're missing the whole point. Genital autonomy for everyone, and I think it holds us back by trying to have a pissing contest, then help us move forward.
Point well made, John.
Thanks. Okay.
But I just think that the intersex space is far more complicated and medical.
It is. And absolutely. Yeah. Because there's so many variations of so many. It's just endless how many different variations. You can look at Brian Earp's talks on it. You can just type in intersex on YouTube, and there's over the past, it seems like 4 to 5 years, there's been a huge amount of information coming out about this. There's TED Talks and all sorts of stuff. Hida Valoria, a friend of mine, she wrote a book, or they wrote a book. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting that they're they, not she, or he. Wrote a book. 7 Gram is another friend here in the LA area that's been involved with trying to create materials to help educate people and all that on the topic. So I'm involved in a few different groups on Facebook. With
a friend of mine did a documentary about this for the national broadcaster here in Australia, called the ABC, and I was then put in touch with a number of intersex people that appeared on his documentary, and they shared some literature with me. And what I've now come to understand is that 20 years ago and further back in Australia, the interventions were done very early. Yeah. According to the binary, whatever they were the closest to. But now it's changed to not intervene so much and allow the intersex person to decide if and what kind of surgery that they would like later. So that's been the change here in Australia.
Good. That's good to hear. There's one hospital here in the U.S. that apologized publicly and put it up on their website and all that to the intersex people, and say, yeah, maybe we should delay these surgeries as long as as long as you're able to urinate and everything. There's really no reason to rush the surgeries and do it as other children. So yeah, it's a very interesting topic. So.
Yeah. But because the cohort is so much smaller, I'm not sure that we should be bringing it in, because the genital surgery that occurs in the intersex space is different to what we're talking about with general circumcision for males.
Well, there's actually a bloodstained pants protester that I met. This is actually where I kind of got my first introduction to intersex. Her name, I'm not even sure whether. Anyways, Anastasia Lindsay Rogers is this person that has protested a lot with the bloodstained men, has traveled across the country many times.
Oh, God bless her.
Yeah, I met Anastasia. Anastasia has a female name, but I'm thinking that Anastasia is changing to just being called them or whatever. But Anastasia protests with the bloodstained men because Anastasia sees it all as connected, because it's coming down to genital autonomy still. Yeah. So
I don't know too much about the intersex space, so I've got to.
So you can watch videos on Bonobo 3D, and you'll identify Anastasia. Often, Anastasia talks about everyone deserves, their genitalia, the genitalia they're born with, or whatever, and she'll include male, female, and intersex. So she'll include
well, putting it that way and thinking about it, I think Anastasia has a point.
Yeah. There's definitely some rifts in between the intersex community about talking about this, but I've even had a conference call like this with a handful of intersex people. I think the person that was leading it was in Las Vegas, actually, and I've been well received multiple times on this, particularly when
Wow.
it comes to the Genital Autonomy Society,
Wow.
about, because I'm fighting for their right for them to keep their genitalia too, and so it's been pretty well received. So
But clearly, for an intersex person who has some type of male external genitalia,
mhm.
for that to be intact, there's a definite correlation, isn't there, between
Oh yeah.
what we've been talking about?
Yeah, even trans people argue about this sometimes because, like, if they wanted to transition to female and get the surgery, the prep use is extremely valuable to do that, right? So
So, the part where there's a great deal of commonality is that if we're saying that it's inexcusable to cut the genitals of a baby boy,
mhm.
to remove the prepuce,
Yeah.
then for a trans or an intersex, it equally applies. So
Yeah.
that's very, very clear. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the trans and intersex thing kind of overlaps sometimes. I came across one story of a person that considered themselves trans, and then he later found out, I don't know how he found out, but he found out that he was actually born intersex. He was actually born closer to the other sex that he was identifying with, right?
Okay.
So then it all of a sudden made sense that he
Oh,
or she was, trans. That's,
okay.
yeah. So, these intersex surgeries could be creating some of these issues with trans.
Yeah.
I think that coming to understand intersex situations has helped me understand more about how it's, your brain can really mess with you and make you want to be one way or the other, and even though your physical attributes aren't 100% that way or the other.
The, the few trans I got to know as a result of this documentary, the feeling that I just walked away with is that their trauma and psychological issues far outweighs what you and I were talking about earlier on.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these, they're so horribly mutilated they can't have kids, or they can't have reasonable sex or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we need a lot of understanding, a lot of patience, a lot of love in that
Yeah.
space.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Totally agree with that. An open mind and listening to each other
Mm, mm.
on this for sure. So the last item that I have on the list is about social productivity, and the first thing that comes to mind is, if our surgeons and moils and whoever, butchers or whatever you want to call them, weren't spending time cutting genitals without a medical need, what would they be doing instead? I mean, maybe they would be curing cancer or solving our COVID problems. I don't know.
In society, there is a lack of resources. In the Western world, there is, despite the unemployment, there is a labor shortage of professional people.
Yep.
And if you're talking in the medical field, there is such a great deal of medical ailments that are going untreated due to lack of resources.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than having all this surgery and all this resources tied into supporting these children with these globs of Vaseline and visits to the pediatrician for any complications, my goodness, John, there is such a need for these professionals to be doing other productive work to assist with the human condition.
Huge opportunity. Absolutely.
Yeah.
When this pandemic started, a lot of us realized, so the hospitals are being told to only do necessary surgeries. Well, hey, guess what? This one is not. So hospitals stop doing this, so you don't waste PPE and important resources. Some did actually stop, And it was interesting because some, you see some tweets about people mad because they couldn't get their child, circumcised. But then other hospitals just continued on. So
You see, John, a lot of the people I've spoken to, both in Australia and in the United States, will say that one of the main decisions that they chose to do this procedure was because their private insurance covered it. And they were being told, this is such a wonderful opportunity, it's covered, do it. And so when it's given to you in that perspective, wow, I'm getting a health benefit and it's being paid for. Whereas the mentality is not there to think that why do this in the first place. And right now we're talking about the fact that there's people that basically, I know of surgeons that this is all they do. There are clinics in Brisbane with 5 or 6 doctors, and from dusk till dawn, or the other way around, from morning till night, this is all they do. It's like a cookie cutter. So they're full-time, just dedicated to cutting baby boys. So these are trained doctors, and please don't tell me that with the waiting lists we have for so many surgeries and so many other ailments, that these medically trained doctors could not be doing other work that's assisting sick people.
Yeah, I often compare it to another business. Medicine is a business. So is McDonald's. And I actually worked at McDonald's when I was a teenager, and one of the things they taught you to do is say, "Hey, you want fries with that?" And this even goes, a little bit further. It's like, "You want fries with that? It's free." It's like, who's going to say no to that?
Well, that's a really good example, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just because something is free doesn't mean that you should do it.
Yeah, and when you look at history of how of the rates of circumcision rising, and you put another rate right next to it, and that's the rate of hospital births rising. They both rose together. Duh.
I actually do think that giving birth in the hospital is a good thing, but it's safe and you've got access to medical care in case you need it. And I know that many people won't agree with me, but can we just stop the cutting?
Yeah, I agree. It's a challenging thing for me. Both my sons were born home.
Okay.
And after seeing that process, I recognized something. And I've of course, you can watch videos of people having birth at hospitals all the time. But hospitals, they're often telling you, push, don't push, push, don't push, or whatever, right? They're ordering you around. And I just imagine if I was sitting on the toilet and I had a bunch of people standing around me saying push, I think the opposite would happen.
I know. Quite well made.
But at the same time, being close to the right professionals and facilities and tools and everything to deal with something if it happens, that's a value too. So one of the things that has risen lately as popularity is birth centers. So the birth center would be like right next to the hospital or whatever. And you can and with birth centers you could have a midwife instead of having like an OB or whatever, and they'll take a slightly different approach, a little more of a natural approach, and maybe not medicine, put a lot of medicine in you or whatever that would drown you out or whatever.
But again, John, there's a wide variety of people. For some low risk cohorts, home is fine, birth centers are fine. There are some couples that are at very high risk for various reasons, and they would be pre-booked for having a cesarean section and things like that. So I think that whatever circumstance you're in, I think is okay. The bit I don't think is okay is to obviously have a preputial amputation as part of the package.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think I said my wife is a trained doula. Maybe I
Yeah,
include that. So yeah,
yeah,
yeah. There's
and
definitely I mean, you kind of have to deal with it all on a case by case basis, obviously.
yes,
Yeah,
and
it's
as you
tricky.
said, if you're in the hospital and your medical insurance covers the preputial amputation, um, the question should be asked, but why?
Yeah,
Don't do it just because it's free,
yeah,
just because it's a good deal.
absolutely. All right,
You
Mark.
can get very good deals on certain cars right now in Australia, and
Yeah,
they're very, very cheap, but they're not safe.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Hang on just 1 second.
you've got to
I'm
go.
almost done.
We're,
All right.
we're almost done here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that was the last item on my list. Is there any other thoughts you want to add to this?
No, I think that the conversation was a very interesting one. I've learnt a number of things from you, and I think that it's been very interesting just to discuss and compare the Australian to the US experience. And it's not as different as what we think. We just use different labels,
Yeah,
but it's a very similar situation in many respects.
yeah. Well, I certainly appreciate you sharing your perspectives, both as an intact man and a man from Australia. I've learned a little more about what's going on down in Australia, and maybe I'll support you guys down there even more so, as much as I can.
And it's been a great honor to be part of the process that you're doing with the filming of these episodes. So thank you.
It's been an honor to have you. Thank you, Mark. All right. Have a great night, or day, or whatever.
I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I'll enjoy the rest of my afternoon.
Okay. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye now.